right now. I hope for you it's not that early, but get your coffee and I hope you will enjoy the session. I'll be talking about Azure Sentinel automation. So Azure Sentinel is the cloud SIEM and SOAR product of Microsoft. You can just implement it as you wish. But when you get in the automation bits for the product, you can really use the product to its full extent. And this is what I'll be talking about today. So first, a little introduction about myself. My name is Stees de Conte, and I'm a senior Microsoft 365 consultant from Belgium. I'm currently working for the Collective Consulting, which is a Microsoft partner. I mainly focus on security, endpoint management, and automation. Just this year, I was awarded with the MVP award. On the social media, I'm active on Twitter, also on my blog 365 by Days, and you can also follow me on LinkedIn. I'm also the technical editor for the Microsoft 365 Security for the IT Pro book, which goes over all the security products within Microsoft 365 and explains them in great detail. So let's just kick it off. What do we have on the agenda? Well, for me, there are three big parts when you're talking about Sentinel automation. We have the APIs and PowerShell modules, which are really about automating the Azure Sentinel backend. So creating incidents, managing alert rules, managing data connectors. Then we have playbooks. Playbooks are used to automate response when an alert or incident comes into Sentinel. So if you have a security incident and you want to automatically react to that, playbooks are the answer. And I'm quickly going to touch upon Azure DevOps, which can be used to automate the deployment of Azure Sentinel, which is a really great tool. And I would recommend everybody with an Azure Sentinel environment to look into Azure DevOps. So just a quick introduction and a quick outline. Okay, what is Azure Sentinel and what are the different moving parts? So Azure Sentinel is actually built upon log analytics. You just enable a solution on top of log analytics, and then you can send all of the data to log analytics. It can be done through data connectors. So you configure data connectors to push information into Azure Sentinel. And then when the data is in Azure Sentinel, you can create alert rules. You can use machine learning. You can go hunting to look, okay, what is in my environment and what kind of security incidents might I have. Then when you're investigating, you can use a portal or Jupyter Notebooks, and then to automatically respond to Azure Sentinel, we are using Azure Logic Apps. Azure Logic Apps are referred inside of Azure Sentinel as playbooks. So when you hear playbooks, it's essentially the same as Azure Logic Apps. So it's a really quick overview of Azure Sentinel. The goal of this session is not to go into great detail what is Azure Sentinel, but how can you automate it. So let's start with the first part, which is the APIs. I'm a big lover of automation, but unfortunately in the Microsoft 365 security environment, you cannot really automate that much. The good thing is in Sentinel you can. So Azure Sentinel actually has 4 different APIs you can use. It might be a bit confusing at first. Why are there 4? But they each have their own function. Sometimes you will use one and sometimes you will use the other. So the number one for me and the one I use the most is the Sentinel Management API. It's based on the general Azure Management API, and you can use it to do all of the Sentinel backend configuration, which means retrieving incidents, creating incidents, setting up alert rules, getting the data connectors, configuring the data connectors, setting up watch lists. Almost everything you can do in the portal with an Azure Sentinel, you can do through the API. Then the second API is a bit smaller. It's the Security Graph API. You might have known this from other Microsoft 365 products. The Security Graph API can retrieve alerts, not incidents. It's a mistake on the PowerPoint. only alerts from the different Microsoft 365 security products. For example, if you would query the Security Graph API, you would retrieve information or alerts from Microsoft Defender for Endpoints, Defender for Identity, and for example, Azure Sentinel. So it's a great way to retrieve alerts, but the annoying thing is you cannot retrieve incidents, which are used often inside of Azure Sentinel. So I don't use the Security Graph API to retrieve alerts because you can do it through Sentinel. What I use the Security Graph API for is to push threat intelligence, which means if you see a specific indicator, that could be an indicator of compromise, you can use the Security Graph API to push that indicator of compromise to your Sentinel environment, and you will receive an alert when, for example, that specific file or that specific IP has been run into. And then I talked about Azure Sentinel is built on top of Log Analytics, and that are the bottom two APIs. So we have the Log Analytics API, which is just to query information from Log Analytics to the API. So for example, if you need to retrieve information from Sentinel, give me all the latest alerts or give me all the latest sign logs, you can really easily do this through Log Analytics API. And then the other Log Analytics API is the data collector, and this can be used to push data in. So I talked about data connectors, data collectors. Sometimes you have the need to create something custom because Microsoft, for example, doesn't support your specific product that you want to ingest logs for. So if you want to build something custom, you have to use a data collector API to push that data into Azure Sentinel. So if we take a little bit deeper into the Azure Management API, which is in my opinion a great API, so it can be used to configure Sentinel, as I said. So what you can do, it's almost all the same actions you can do in the portal. You can do in Azure with the Sentinel Management API, and it's important to know that there are two different versions. We have a preview version and we have a GA version, like almost every other API that Microsoft has. The GA version contains, of course, most of the functions that you need, but when you have to do a little bit more advanced, you will have to use the preview version. I will just quickly pick up the documentation for that API just to show you. The awesome thing is the API is fully documented on GitHub. Examples are sometimes lacking, but here you can really see what is available. So within the security insights, which is the Azure Sentinel API, we have two channels. So we have the preview and we have the stable. This is the API version you have to use. So if we, for example, pick up this table, here we can see the examples and we can see examples for incidents, for alerts, for actions. So if you ever want to know, okay, what action should I use? You can easily check this and know, okay, I should be using the incidents, and with incidents, you can see, let me just quickly show an example. Okay, if I want to create an incident, I should be using these properties. So GitHub has a really awesome place to look into, okay, what are the different environments of the API and which one can I use? The thing is also, if you look into this API, you will sometimes find that there are private preview features documented inside of the API, which are not available inside the portal yet. I know we talked about theory. Let's put it into practice now. I have a few Azure Postman queries. So Postman is just a tool you use to push API queries. It's really easy to use. One important thing, of course, is how do you re-authenticate? The good thing is it's based on the Azure Management API. So it's all based on Azure AD authentication. So what I have is within my Postman, I have configured a Pray script, which will go to login.microsoft.com and retrieve me a bearer token. If I put this bearer token here and I give it with the query, I'm authenticated. The thing is that you have to do is when you create an app registration for this, you have to provide the app registration permissions on site in your Azure Sentinel environment. So for me particularly, I have given it Azure Sentinel contributor rights, which means I can create incidents, create alerts, close alerts, check data connectors, create watch list. Almost everything you can do in Sentinel, you can do with the Azure Sentinel contributor permissions. Now, the thing that might be a little bit daunting at first is, okay, what is the URL we should be using? As you can see, it's a pretty long URL, but actually when you're used to the Azure Manager API, it's really easy to use. So what you have to do is you have to provide a subscription that your Azure Sentinel is in, then provide the resource group that your Azure Sentinel is in, and then you have to give out the Sentinel workspace name. So for me, this is TC Test Sentinel. And then you configure the specific provider. So this means I want to use the Azure Sentinel API. And then starting from this part, we can really see what is Azure Sentinel specific. So here we are going to the incidents and retrieving a specific incident with a specific ID. Now, how can we find this ID? If we go to the Azure Sentinel portal and open up our workspace, so this will be TC Test Sentinel for me, which I'm referencing also in my API query. I can check it out. I can go to incidents. And if the Azure portal wants to work with me, we'll get there soon enough. I can check an incident. Let's try this one. And if I click on full details, the URL on the top will actually change, or I thought it would. But here we can copy the incident link for this particular incident. And with that incident link, I have the incident ID, which I can paste inside of my Postman. It's actually the same as already in there. So I just paste this incident, and now I have the URL for that specific incident. When I do a get to that URL, I will receive every information about this incident, as you can see. So I see the title, I see the description, I see the owner, so who is the incident assigned to, and additional data that you also find in the portal. One important thing to know, of course, is you also have to provide an API version. If I would not provide the API version and try to push out this query, it will fail because an API version is mandatory. So like I said, you have the 2020-0101, which is the GA API. And then you also have the 2019, which is the preview API. So here you will see more features and more data returned instead of an API call. So this can be used as API, for example, to synchronize incidents from your Azure Sentinel environment to your ITSM tool. Now, of course, we want to also update incidents. For this, we can actually use the same URL as we're using right now. So we are referencing the same, it's a different incident now, but we're using the same URL, and we have to use a put method to put data into Azure Sentinel to change it. Now we're using the same kind of authorization, but the important thing is inside of the body, there are a few mandatory tools, properties, So what we have to provide every time is the title of the incident, as severity, a status, and then when we are closing, when we are putting an incident to the closed state, we have to provide a classification and a classification comment, which means, for example, it's a true positive, it's a false positive. If we check the portal, the incidents that we are using right now is in the active state. So what I can do is I will quickly retrieve its ID. And I copied it twice, great. This should be ID of what I want to use. I copy the ID in here, and then important too, we have to copy the title of the incident like this. And then one important thing, which is a bit annoying at first because it's not really that apparent from the documentation, is an E tag. An E tag is essentially what version is the incident you want to update. An e-tag is used to make sure that there are no conflicts. For example, if I and a colleague would update an incident within 5 minutes of each other, we need to know, okay, which of the incidents should be displayed and which should be the correct data. So for that, when you want to update an incident, you always have to go to a get incident. You have to retrieve the current version of that incident. So this is the current e-tag. And then you have to provide that e-tag inside of your query to update that specific incident. So if we click send here right now, it's updated and we can see, okay, right now it's active. If we refresh, it will be closed and you can see the reason for closing, which is the closure comment and closure classification. So this is a really easy way to just update incidents. If you're used to it, it can be really fast, and it's an awesome API to use. Now, one thing I love about the Sentinel API as well is that you can actually create incidents of your own. Normally, incidents are created from analytics rules, which determine, okay, if I see this in the logs, I should create an incident or an alert, but you can also do it through the API. So what we have to do is we have to provide the same URL, but for the incident, you also see we have an ID. What you have to do is you have to go into PowerShell, and you can generate a GUID of your own. So this has to be new GUID. So if you just do new GUID, we can copy this from our PowerShell, and we provide this inside of the query. And then inside of the body, we can see this is a test demo. For example, let's just put this in Global Automation Summit. And if we click send, we can check the Azure Sentinel portal. And if we click refresh, you can see the incident is created. This is some kind of a hidden gem, not that people know about this, but it's a really powerful tool if you want to create incidents from your own, from an API. If you want to synchronize incidents from another place, you can do it with this API. Now, you might have noticed that I'm using, for most of my queries, the GA version of the API. That is also, of course, the preview version of the API, but you really have to check, okay, which queries are possible from which version. For example, we have watch lists in Azure Sentinel. So watch list is a few users that you can set up. For example, your C-level, your CEO, your CFO, you might want to monitor them extra. For them, you can create a watch list, and you can use that watch list within a analytic rule to create extra incidents. For example, if my CEO is receiving a lot of phishing mails, I want to receive an incident and do something about it. If we look into the stable version of the API, you will not see that there are watch lists available. So what we have to do is we have to use the preview version of the API. If you go to example here, we can see watch lists. Now, unfortunately, if you look into the documentation, it's not always that clear what you should use to create a watch list, what kind of properties and how are these properties determined. For example, when should I use \n, when should I not? Should it be spaces or not? So a cool tip, which is actually apparent for every API that Azure has, is if you look into the inspect mode for the Azure portal, and we click refresh, we will see queries that are going to Azure. And if we look in some of these queries, I think, let me wait a little bit before it's all loading. We can actually see which queries the portal is making to the API. Let me check if I can search for management. Yes. So here we can see, okay, this is the URL the portal is actually using. And it's a really awesome way to know, okay, how should I build my queries? What are the Microsoft guys using? So just a quick and easy way to see how the API is being used, because sometimes you do not see as much example as I would love to see. So for example, This is an example to create a watch list. You have to know that for watch list, for example, you have to put up the watch list name here inside of the URL and then also inside of the body. So these are things that are not really that apparent from the documentation and that I got from the Azure portal. Another example is just to retrieve data connectors. If you go to the security insights and the data connectors, we can click send and we will retrieve every data connector which is configured. This is not really that much often used by security analysts, but can be used by a Sentinel administrator to see, okay, which data connectors are configured and which are not, to make sure every data is available that you need. So this was in a really quick way about the management API. So it's a really extensive API for Azure Sentinel, and you can do almost everything you can do from the portal. I highly recommend it when you're trying to automate Azure Sentinel. The other API we talked about is the Log Analytics API. I'll just show this with an example. For the Log Analytics API, we can go to api.loganalytics.io and we have to provide the workspace ID. With this workspace ID, we can configure a query, and here we can write any query we want. So if I would send this, I will retrieve the latest 5 sign-in logs from my Azure Sentinel environment. As you can see, the outputs of the API is not that useful. Okay, it's useful. I mean, it's just a little bit tricky to retrieve the data and format the data. Because here we first see the columns. So every column that the data is putting us to. For example, the first column is tenant ID. And then if we close this, we can see the rows. So within the rows, we do not have the column name, but we know from the columns bit, okay, this is the tenant ID. So it's important that when you're using this data, I kind of built a formatter, which just says I input the query I receive from Log Analytics API, and I say, okay, I want to retrieve the tenant ID column, and it will dynamically retrieve the tenant ID column. It's a really important step when you're trying to use the data from the Log Analytics API. So it's a pretty easy API to use. You can do a lot with it. I mostly use it, for example, to create Power BI reports. Because you can retrieve every data you have in Sentinel and report on incidents on SLAs, almost everything you can do from Power BI as well. Now, we talked about APIs a lot. There's also 2 PowerShell modules available for Azure Sentinel. We have one Microsoft official, and we have one for Azure's a community-driven project. So AZ Sentinel is a community-driven project. It was originally written by Wortel, which is a partner from the Netherlands, and now is being maintained by Pujan, who is an MVP, an Azure MVP, also working from the Netherlands. So the AZ Sentinel was the first PowerShell module out there. It's a really awesome tool. And it provides a lot of capabilities. The Microsoft official one doesn't support as much capabilities I would like, unfortunately. It's the official one, it's supported by Microsoft, but you cannot do everything you can do with the API. So I would really recommend, if you're trying to use the PowerShell module, use the AZ Sentinel one. It's heavily maintained, it's added features weekly almost. And if you ever have questions, you can reach Prion really easy through the GitHub page or to Twitter, and it's a really awesome thing to do. So this was APIs and PowerShell modules. I've seen I'm running a bit out of time from my head, so I'll quickly go to playbooks. So as I mentioned, playbooks are automated actions you can do from Azure Sentinel, which are logic apps. So you create a logic app, and that logic app will execute a few actions. And these actions can do data enrichment or automation. So for me, it's important that there are 2 capabilities for playbooks. You can do automated actions, which means if I receive a failed sign-in, a quick example, just if I receive a failed sign-in from a particular user, I want to block that user in Azure AD. That's an example of an automated action. Another thing is enrichment. For example, if I have a user logging in from an IP, I want to know, okay, what is the IP country? What is the IP reputation? Just tell me more information about this IP, the network owner, for example. I want to put that information inside of the incident, which means if a SecOps analyst is going through the incident, he can immediately see information about that particular IP, which is a really cool way to use Azure Logic Apps. Now, Azure Logic Apps can be a little bit daunting at first. That's why it's important to go slow in the beginning and to investigate, okay, what can I do? And then really start off with a plan. But within Logic Apps, it's important to know that you have two different kinds of building blocks. I often call Azure Sentinel, I often call it Lego. Let me just quickly show you with an example. If I'm in a Logic App, I can go to Logic App Designer. So as I mentioned, there are playbooks in Azure Sentinel, but they're called Logic Apps in the Azure portal. If I quickly delete this one, I can create a new step, and Azure Sentinel has actions and has triggers. A trigger is when should this Logic App run. An action is what kind of execution should I do. So if you want to create a playbook, so an Azure Sentinel playbook, the trigger has to be an Azure Sentinel. The trigger has to be an Azure Sentinel trigger. So for example, I can here click Azure Sentinel, and you can see there are two kind of Azure Sentinel triggers. We have a trigger for an alert, and we have a trigger for an incident. Now, when you go to the portal, you will see that we have incidents and we have alerts. Right now, it's only possible to trigger based on an alert. So when I receive an alert, the Logic App will be triggered. But an incident can have multiple alerts, which means an incident can trigger the same Logic App multiple times. For example, if you want to sync incidents from Sentinel to Jira, you cannot really use the Azure Sentinel alert trigger because this will really synchronize the alerts. So this is why Microsoft has implemented the incident creation rule, which will be triggered when a new incident has been created. But this is private preview at the moment. I cannot really tell you what it's going to be or what it's going to become, but it will be an awesome feature coming out, I hope, in the next couple of months, which will really augment the automation capabilities you have inside of Azure Sentinel. So do watch out for this because it will be a really awesome tool. But if I click on when a response to an Azure incident is triggered, I can save this. And now when I go to the Azure Sentinel portal, bear with me when the Azure portal is loading. I will see that right now it's defined as a playbook within Sentinel because we have configured the trigger for Azure Sentinel. So if we go inside of the Azure portal to playbooks, we will see the Logic App called empty demo. Where do you have it? Right here. And you can see the trigger kind is Azure Sentinel. So when this is a trigger kind Azure Sentinel, we can use this to automate. So how can we now couple or do the automation? When do we trigger this Logic App? Actually, two ways. One thing we can do is if we go to analytics, we can link that playbook to a specific analytic rule, which means every time an alert is created for that specific analytic rule, this playbook will be running. So if we edit this analytics rule and we go to automated response, here you will see our empty demo. So we only see playbooks here with the trigger kind Azure Sentinel. If we click this and click save, this playbook will be coupled to this analytics rules, which means if an alert is created, this playbook will be triggered. Now, this is one way to trigger a playbook, which is an automated way. If you want to do the action every single time, for example, for enrichment, this is the way to go. But what you can also do is if you go to a specific incident, and you go to the details, you will see all the alerts which are inside of this incident. Let me show you this one. So if you go to full details, for that incident, we can see the multiple alerts which are inside of that incident. And if we scroll to the right, we can see few playbooks. And here we can actually trigger our playbook. And when we run it, let me just quickly show it to you. We can go to the run history and we can see that this playbook is triggered. So now we can see, okay, it has run, and you will see all the detailed information about the alert that we have generated and that we have triggered. So 2 ways to assign a playbook to an alert rule. You can trigger it manually, or you can do it every time an analytic rule is run. It's important to know that if you want to assign a playbook to every one of your analytics rules, right now you have to manually add a playbook to every one of your rules. You can do it through the API automatically, but you have to assign the playbook to every one of your rules manually. Now, these are the 2 triggers. So we have incident private preview and we have alert, which is GA. We also have actions, of course. So actions are the subsequent steps we can take. You can see a lot is a little bit the same as in the API, because Logic Apps use the API in the background. But here, for example, we can do get incident. And what it will do is we can use the data from the alert to retrieve the incident this alert belongs to. So we need subscription ID, we need the resource group, we need the workspace ID, and then we need the system alert ID. So important to use the system alert ID, you don't use the provider alert ID, because the provider alert ID is, for example, the ID from Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So if we use this one, we now have information about this incident. Why should we care? Well, if we click add, we can actually create, for example, a comment. So we can add a comment to that specific incident, but a comment is really is bound to an incident, is not bound to an alert. So if you want to do incident-specific things, you have to retrieve the incident pertaining to that specific alert. So here we provide the incident ID. To quick show you an example, this is a test comment. If we would save this playbook and we run it again from our incident, we click run. If you now go to the playbook, and instead of comments, we should be seeing a comment. Here, this is a test comment. So this comment is added from our Logic app. Now, this is a basic example, of course. Let's augment it. For example, I have an incident pertaining to Sander. When I retrieve an incident from Sander, I want to know some more information. For example, I want to know what is his job title. Is he an IT administrator? Is he a SOC analyst? Is he my CEO? Is he department? Is he in IT? Is he in facility? Is he in finance? And for example, the location. Is he in the US? Is he in Europe? These are important things to know that a SOC analyst will be able to use when investigating an incident. It's really easy to put that information inside of the incident so that the SOC analyst doesn't have to look for this himself. So instead of empty demo, we have a few building blocks already. One important thing to know is when you're using Azure Sentinel or Logic Apps in general, you will have connections. Connections means how am I authenticated to the product I'm using. If I click add new, you can see I have immediately the option to sign in. I have the option for a service principal and for a managed entity. Managed entity is awesome, but it's still in preview, so I don't use it that often. So we have the choice between service principal and signing in. Now, when I sign in, the Logic app is bound to my account. As you can see, I'm adding the comments, which one can be confusing for the SOC analyst because it stays adding this manually or automatically. But also, if my account would ever be removes, or my permissions would be removed, the logic app would stop working. So you do not want to use a user account. Even in a service account, I'm not a fan of service accounts. I do not recommend service accounts. So what you have to do is you can use a service principal. So this is an app registration. So inside of the Azure AD portal, you can create an app registration, and then you give that app registration permissions to Azure Sentinel. Right now, I have already created one. So I provide the tenant's ID for that app registration, the client ID for that registration, and then the client secret. Give it a name, app registration. And now I'm authenticating with this app register, with this service principal. So I click add, and now I have to change the connection for every one of my actions. So do this, and then go here. I click save. So what we could do is we could trigger the logic app from side of the portal again. But what you can also do is you can re-trigger it from the Azure portal, from the logic app itself. If you click resubmit, it will be submitted again. And then we go here. It's added, and if we update the incident, okay, it is from an application. It's using the service principal, which is much, much better. Now, the next step is we want to get information about a specific user in that incident. By default, users are not included inside of a get incident. A user is included as an entity. So we have to retrieve the entities for that specific incident. So there is a built-in step, get accounts. So an account entity, as you can see here, Sander is the account entity. So we want to retrieve Sander, his name, from that incident dynamically. So this is done through entities. So if we click save here, okay, this is great. We now have the user, which is the alert that's pertaining to. Then we want to query the Graph API. So what we can do is there are some built-in connectors for the Graph API. Here, for example, I do not like them because they're not really that extensive as I would love. So I am mostly using HTTP actions, and which are going to, for example, which are using get, and then going to http.graph.microsoft.com. Now, which query you want to use? Let me just quickly show you in the Graph Explorer. So if I sign in the Graph Explorer, it's a really awesome way to test out the graph queries that you are using. And if you go to data users, and we query the I'm sorry, this is working from home, right? So I query the user, and if I click run, I will retrieve the user information for that particular user. So I want to use graph.microsoft.com data users, and then I want to retrieve the UPN. Now, this UPN will be in the get accounts. Let me quickly show you if I still have an example of the get accounts output, because the UPN is not directly in there. What will we get is we'll retrieve the name for the user and the UPN suffix. So we have to add the name, then a @ sign, and then the UPN suffix. Important to know that this is an array, which means it can contain multiple entries. In this case, we only want to retrieve the first entry for accounts, and then use name plus UPN suffix. So how is this done? This cannot be done dynamically through the portal, because, for example, if I would retrieve the account's name, it will create a for each loop. I do not want this in particular case. I only run it once. So I have to delete the for each loop. And what I can do is I can use custom expressions. This is where logic apps are getting a little bit advanced, but it's really awesome to use, and I highly recommend to use custom expressions. And here we have to combine the first entry for the account name and the first entry for the UPN suffix. I have this in my notepad saved here. So what is this? Is retrieve the output for the accounts, action, then retrieve the first entry in accounts, retrieve the name and the UPN suffix, and do a string concatenation, which means combine them all into one string. So if I copy this, I will have the UPN suffix, which I can use inside of my query. So I click here, I add the expression, and I click OK. Now, of course, I still have to authenticate. Authenticating is once again done through an app registration. So we have to provide once more our tenant ID. Then the audience is the Graph API because we're going through the Graph API. And we have to provide the client ID, which again I have created, and I have given this app registration enough permissions to retrieve this. And then we have to give in the secret. Now you could just paste the secret here, and you will have all the information that you need. But of course, when someone is visiting this Logic app, even a reader, he will see this secret in plain text. So what we need to do is you can integrate with Key Vault. One of the high recommendations is to use Azure Key Vault. For example, here I have created a demo Key Vault. And if we look here inside of secrets, you will see the Graph API secret I have. So you add the secrets in here, and what you have to do then also is provide access policies. So you have to configure who can authenticate to this Key Vault, who can, for example, list secrets and who can retrieve secrets. For this, I really recommend using managed entities. So to show you, let's just quickly save this. If you go to identity, we can create a managed entity, which means the Logic app essentially becomes a service principal. So when we save this, and it's saved, should be saved in a second, we can go to the Logic app, go to the access policy, select the service principal, and now here we will find our Logic app that we need. So for me, this is empty demo. And I want to do this least privilege. So do not select everything, but only select get and list. And if we click add and save here, we can now retrieve this secret from a Key Vault. So really quickly, if we add an extra step here, search for Key Vault. You can do a get secret. And then I can connect with a managed entity. This is preview, I know, but the managed entity for Key Vault is really awesome to use. So just click create. And now we will be authenticated as the Logic app. And here we can retrieve these secrets. Unfortunately, I won't be able to create the Logic app entirely due to time constraints, but just let's move on to some tips and tricks that I wanted to give you when building playbooks, Logic apps with Azure Sentinel. They're powerful too. If you're using Sentinel without Logic apps, I think you're doing something wrong. But how do you get started? Well, one important thing to know is that there is an awesome community for Logic apps, and Microsoft is actually maintaining a list of Logic apps itself inside of Azure Sentinel GitHub. So if you go to the Azure Sentinel GitHub, there is a folder playbooks. And this contains some out-of-the-box playbooks that you can use. There are a lot of them. I really recommend you look inside of here to check which playbooks you can start with. They can be an example to check, okay, how are they using different actions? And then you can copy these actions and build the playbooks of your own. So what I did in the beginning is I used the Azure Sentinel GitHub as a repository. I checked, okay, which ones can I use, which one can I not? Then I started small. I know it's some kind of cliche to say, but start small, try things out, do it carefully, and then move on to bigger things. Because you have to be mindful of the architecture of your playbooks. Because when you're building playbooks, you can suddenly have 100 playbooks, but some of the actions might be combined. So you have to be really careful with how you're building playbooks and how you're managing them. So make sure you're not building monolithic playbooks which do everything. Start small, do small actions, and make reusable parts so you can reuse playbooks for different actions. So best practices, I talked about this during the little demo I gave you. Use service principles to authenticate as much as possible. Don't store the secrets in the logic app, store it in Key Vault. And also one really important thing I do not see a lot of people using, monitor your playbooks. When your playbooks fails, I want to know when it fails, and I should receive, for example, a text message or an incident in Sentinel to know, okay, this playbook has failed. This is important because when you're depending on playbooks, you should really be able to depend on them and make sure that they are executing correctly. This can only be done if you're monitoring them and you make sure that all the data is right. So these are playbooks really quick. It's a really important tool. I know it can be a little bit daunting at first, really also for the expressions. The expressions are the custom expressions used with the concatenate, etc. It can be daunting, but you will learn pretty quickly. And you should really be using these custom expressions when you're trying to build logic apps, because they allow you to do much more than the built-in actions. Within Azure Sentinel, we can also use Azure Functions. Azure Functions can use the own code that we want to write. So you can just create a PowerShell script that you want to use. The downside is that functions cannot be directly triggered from an Azure Sentinel alert rule. So we would first have to create a logic app, and then that logic app would have triggered a function. It's possible, it's just not that perfect. Now, with only 10 minutes to spare, I want to dive into really quick into Azure DevOps. You might say, okay, Azure DevOps, it's not meant for me. It's too big, it's too advanced. I'm not using it. But I really think every Sentinel environment could benefit from it. So as you know, Azure DevOps is the CI/CD tool from Microsoft, continuous improvement, continuous deployment. So you can use it to deploy everything that you have in Sentinel. You can also deploy through DevOps. It's just scripts that you deploy. So we use PowerShell scripts or PowerShell code to push out more information into Azure Sentinel. Why do I recommend this? Well, there are actually two ways. One is for an MSSP. For example, we are managing a lot of different customers. I do not want to create the analytics rules or hunting rules in each tenant manually. I want to do this automatically. This can be done through Azure DevOps. The other thing is too, when you're just a small, your organization don't have an MSSP, you might say, I don't need DevOps. But here for this, you need the 4ICE principle, which means if somebody suddenly creates an alert rule or changes an alert rule, he might make a mistake or he's an insider threat. Well, for this, to avoid this, you need to be able to monitor and to make sure that somebody approves the change beforehand. Okay, you could put this into a formal process, but you cannot rule out human error. So what you can do is you can set up Azure DevOps, and they can deploy, they can add the code for that analytics rules inside of Azure DevOps. And now somebody has to approve that code. So they have to check, okay, is this what we wanted to do? And only when it's approved, will this alert rule be added? So in an ideal scenario, to follow best practices and conventions, you do not use the Azure portal to create new alert rules, to create new hunting queries, to create new playbooks. You only use Azure DevOps, so all your changes are audited, and you have a really awesome overview of all the pull requests that you are using. Now, I'm not an expert in Azure DevOps myself. Microsoft has published Sentinel as a code, which is a demo environment for using Azure DevOps with Azure Sentinel. Again, I cannot take credit here. Puyan, which is the same person who is developing the AZ Sentinel PowerShell module, has also published a blog on tech community for Azure DevOps. And he has built an environment which you can just copy and use to build your own Azure Sentinel environments through Azure DevOps. I will quickly show you a demo. of how you can use this. So in Azure Sentinel, we have pipelines, and in a pipeline, let me check. How is this pipeline built? Well, you just configure the Azure Sentinel environment that you want to push to. So provide the service connection, provide the subscription ID, provide everything that DevOps needs to authenticate to Azure Sentinel. And then you can see, okay, what do I want to use? Do I want to create a Sentinel environment? Do I want to push out analytics rules? Do I push out hunting rules, playbooks? So here you can really say what should I use in DevOps? What do I want to use, and which don't I want to use? I recommend start small, only begin with analytics rules. Just leave everything empty and start with the rules because it's really easy to do. So how are these rules built? Well, if we go to the repos, so the Azure repos, this is essentially GitHub. We can go to the settings file, and here we can see alert rules.json. This is an array of all the rules that you want to push. So it's really easy to add all the rules that you have in one single document or in multiple documents, if you like, doesn't matter. And this will be used to push out the rule to Azure Sentinel. To just quickly show an example, let me check which rules I currently have active within my Azure Sentinel environment. So go to the TC test and go to analytics rules. I want to show you I don't have any rules configured from Azure DevOps at the moment. So this one is called alert rule 1. So I have it right now. I will delete these two. And what can I do? So within Azure DevOps, you have branches, and branches is something from Git. So it means you always have a main branch, which is production, but you can also have a development branch, which is used to test features. So if I'm a developer and I go to the development branch, which I do not see right now. Let me see. Okay, it doesn't exist. Let me just quickly create a new branch. So this will just copy the main production branch, and it will create a new branch for me. If I now go to the files and go to the development branch, go to the alert rules, you will see everything is the same here. What can I do is me as an Azure Sentinel architect, I can create my rules, I can put it in development, and I do not affect the production. I can have the development be pushed to a test environment automatically to test our DevOps pipeline. And it's just, you do not impact production, which is really important to know, that you do not push out rules that you have not tested. If I just change this to alert rule 2, I click commit. So I'm pushing this to the development branch. This is done for testing. In a production environment, you would have 3 or more different branches for production, for testing, and for development. And then when you have that branch, and when you have committed it and you're sure of the change that you want to push, you can create a pull request. When you create a pull request, you're asking, okay, I want to put this from development into main. You give it a title and a description, which an approval will read. And if I click create, the pull request will be created. Now, this is not automatically pushed into production. This has to be approved. Right now, of course, I am the only admin inside of this environment, so I cannot ask somebody else to approve it. But in theory, now somebody else would come in, look and see, okay, what changes are made and how will this impact our environment? If he is happy with the changes, I can approve it. And when this is approved, I can complete it. So when I complete it, I will merge it and I will push the changes that are in development and push it into production. So right now, if we go to the Files tab and go to the main, you should see that it has changed to alert rule 2, which was alert rule 1 before. The pipelines have been configured automatically to run. So when a change has been done in the production repo, the pipeline will run. And what it will do, we can check the details of this pipeline. it will create that rule for us inside of our environment. So you do not have to go to the Azure Sentinel environment yourself. It will all be done automatically when something is pushed into production, into the production repo. It will be automatically pushed to Azure Sentinel, and the rule will be created. So really awesome way to automate your Sentinel and do Sentinel as code. So you do not have to go to the Azure portal to configure anything. You can do it. You can let Azure DevOps do it himself. So if I click refresh here, we will see the rule created. So a really quick way, a quick demo of Azure DevOps. There's much more behind it. I really recommend looking into the blog post from Priyan on the tech community. I'll link it after the session, but it's a really awesome resource. So with 3 minutes to spare, I'm coming to the conclusion of my session. It was a lot of information, but you can do a lot of automation within Sentinel. It can be daunting at first because you have a lot of possibilities. For example, the number of APIs, we have 4. Just look into them, see what fits for you, and just start small. This is something I want to give you. Start small. Look into what do I want to automate, and then take small steps and build up an architecture and build up a plan. For playbooks and also just for Sentinel entirely, you can use the Azure Sentinel GitHub page, which is a really awesome tool to look into examples that Microsoft or the community has created. So you can get some examples of how it's done. Then the last 2 things for playbooks, be sure to use monitoring. So monitor your playbooks for failures, and also use service principals to make sure that you do not authenticate as a service account or a user, but you authenticate as a service principal, which is much more resilient for account changes. So with 2 minutes to spare, I'm at the end of my session. I want to thank Ras for the opportunity to present here, and I hope you have all enjoyed it. If there are any questions, I think I'll answer them in the chat, so I give the chance for the next session to begin then.
So thank you, Thijs. That was a really great session. And as you said, you covered it from beginning to end. You covered a lot of ground. So I want to thank you for that great session and for kicking off the event today. So once again, Thijs, if you could please share your contact details, that would be great.